Hello, it's Aaron here, and it is time for the 12th video update for the What If 2 interactive wargame campaign, following the events of the first month or so of 1746. Now, those of you that can remember, I know it has been a little while, we had a pretty dramatic last video, and I thought in the aftermath of the battle at Wetherby that we would be presenting our final video when it came to do number 12. But it seems that is not the case. Let me fill you in on what's been going on, because I know some of you have been very keen to find out. The reason that it's been a little bit longer than perhaps planned is simply because there's been so much happening that any video update might have given too much information to the participants and influenced the game. So I'll catch you up now that it seems a little safer. Let's start by taking ourselves back to those last few days of December then, when the Jacobite army under Charles Edward smashed into the line of Cumberland's and Hawley's united armies just to the north of Wetherby as they made their run towards London. That battle, brutal, high casualties on both sides, smashed some of the power of the Jacobite army. Although at the time of the battle itself it felt like a decisive victory had been won for Cumberland, and although the Jacobite hopes of getting to London seemed to have been dashed and what remained of the army was now in retreat, things weren't entirely rosy for the British forces either. In fact, Cumberland had to spend a bit of time trying to rally some of his broken units and to assess what the damage done to his forces was, and then he had to contend with the fact that there was still an important unknown quantity. Had the Jacobite run into Yorkshire done enough to trigger a French invasion of the south of England? If Cumberland did turn around and rush up to Scotland, following the Prince's army that way, did he potentially leave England bereft of defences if the French landing was imminent? That's the context then for the decision made by our government team, perhaps a surprising decision not to pursue with full force all of the Jacobite retreat back to the north. They did send Thomas Fulk and the cavalry to pursue the Jacobites back northwards, in particular to make sure they didn't attempt to try and cut across the Pennines and then make a dash south down the opposite side of the country, potentially to link up with some French forces landing in the south. As for the rest of the forces, Cumberland himself and most of the foot moved down to Doncaster, so they were in a central position to move south if necessary, if the French came, whilst biding their time before slowly moving up to press the remnants of the Jacobite forces. A small number of forces were detached to York as well as a garrison, again in case the Jacobites tried to double back, and the captured colours, guns and some reinforcement units were dispatched to the capital too. Now, our Jacobites desperately wanted to get back to Scotland. At this point, the only place where they hoped to be able to salvage something of a strategic plan for the rest of the campaign. And they didn't want to try and make their way across the border being doggedly pursued by Fulk and his cavalry. So they decided at Pierce Bridge in County Durham that they were going to turn and deter their pursuers. You can see on the plan here from a couple of decades after the battle that you've got the river running through, whilst most of the village is on the north side. On the south side of the river, the bridge carries the road in a dogleg with a roadside tavern and a few buildings clustered along it there. That was the spot then. The Jacobite rearguard attempted to make a stand and drive off the pursuing cavalry at Piercebridge on the very first day of January 1746. Here then, in the wintry light, we see the dragoons moving towards Piercebridge, just as you would today. They're going along the road past the inn and then turning sharply onto the old bridge itself. And just beyond the bridge, as a tempting target, is the small surviving squadron of Jacobite horse, the Fitzjames horse, disciplined but tired, and a tempting target for these enthusiastic, victorious, triumphant dragoons. At the enthusiastic approach of the dragoons, the Fitzjames horse simply retires up the street into the village, making it look very much just like the retreating rearguard of the shattered remnants of the Jacobite army. The dragoons inevitably pursue 2 squadrons crossing over the bridge. As they move and deploy, they suddenly come under fire. The enclosures from the village beyond them burst into life, smoke and flashes of musketry, and the dragoons in little bother. You can see one of them dropping from his saddle here. The Jacobite Highlanders here have in fact mounted a rearguard ambush. They've put men in the churchyard and across the road in the enclosures of some of the houses as well, hoping to lure with their cavalry the dragoons down the narrow street and then traversing them with musketry as they go. As this was an ambush, the squadron of dragoons that charged down the road towards Fitzjames wasn't able to see the Jacobites in the church and churchyard until they opened fire. And so they did take the bait. They went down the road. They were engaged from at the front by Fitzjames, and they were fired into from the flank as they made their charge. Meanwhile, the other squadron, not attempting to take their horses down the narrow street, dismounted and began an exchange of fire with the Highlanders in the village. Although the initial ambush fire from the Jacobites had taken a few men down, the exchange of musketry that followed was pretty ineffective, and once the dragoons had been pushed back from the road, they decided that discretion was now the better part of valour, and the squadrons retired back across Pierce Bridge. There was a last flurry of musketry, and then the Jacobites, under cover of darkness, withdrew from the village and rejoined their main body, continuing north. Fulk and his cavalry had had their noses slightly bloodied. They hadn't taken any great losses, but they had decided these Jacobites did still have teeth and probably didn't want to be pursued too closely. From that point on, Fulk did continue to trail the Jacobites, but not to exert any great pressure on them. And in fact, once he got to the border, he slowed down to rest his horses too. He was now a considerable distance away, of course, from Cumberland, who remained at Doncaster, waiting for confirmation that there was no French landing that he needed to worry about in the south. This meant a combination of factors that allowed the Jacobites some room to breathe. They crossed the border, marching up through Lauderdale, returned to Edinburgh, made a show of confidence at Holyrood Palace, but then prepared to move on from there round towards Stirling. Now, Stirling, whilst the English campaign had been going on, had been taken by the Duke of Argyll, and Argyll, having taken it and occupied it, putting the Earl of Loudon in as governor, had moved up to Perth. Now, the intelligence that the government forces had was that at Blair Castle, the Jacobite Duke of Atholl, Marquis of Tullibardine, he had a regiment there which had been recruited in the lowlands just after the Jacobites had made their dash across the border. There was also rumours growing that there had been a new regiment raised near Inverness, the Clancaton, and so Argyll was considering making an aggressive march to stamp out any remaining Jacobite forces in the north of Scotland. This he did, but it was rather too late. He marched up to Blair Castle only to discover that some time before, Tullibardine had already moved on and in fact moved to Inverness and linked up with the Clanhatton up there. So the Jacobites have potentially 2 regiments at least up at Inverness. Argyll is now alert to the fact that the Jacobite main body is potentially threatening. He doesn't want to get caught between 2 fires, and so he removes himself back to Perth and, in fact, begins to prepare for a potential naval evacuation if necessary. He doesn't quite have the strength to face the Jacobite field army, even in its reduced state after its defeat in England. Now, that Jacobite army, which has come round from Edinburgh past Stirling, summoned Stirling to surrender, although that's largely a show of bluff, then disappears. There is an expectation it's going to make a move on Argyll, but it doesn't. So there is an assumption that perhaps it has tried to move north to link up with Tullibardine. This is roughly similar to what happened in our last iteration of the campaign when the defeated Jacobite remnants were driven into the north and made their last stand at Blair. But putting out the Georgia Rangers to scout doesn't seem to detect them there either. Where have the Jacobites gone? Not for the first time in this campaign, our government forces have managed to just lose contact with the Jacobite army for long enough for them to slip off the radar. Nevertheless, there remains a confidence that the Jacobite army is so weakened by its defeats and its campaigning that we are surely moving into the end game now. Cumberland turns about, marches up, and heads towards the border at last. In the middle of January, there are reports in several locations of French ships attempting to land supplies, potentially men, around Scotland. This causes some consternation, but then there comes news that 2 French frigates have been sighted just off Mull. Despite being outgunned, the Royal Navy decides that its little flotilla in the area, led by HMS Greyhound, but with Terror and Baltimore in support, they attempt to cut off these French vessels. They have an advantage with the wind initially, and the plan is to use the smaller vessels to rush around and rake the rear of the French ships whilst they're stuck in the narrow constraints of these waters. It doesn't work, however, and they are forced to face the full power of the broadsides, and with Terror knocked out of action and Greyhound severely battered, the wind turns. The French are able to release themselves from the potential trap, and they sail away. They do not, however, linger to capture their opponents. Instead, they sail off into the horizon and presumably head back to France. But all of these rumours and swirlings make everybody very uneasy. Are there French troops potentially landing in the Western Highlands? Are there French guns landing in the Western Highlands? Is this enough to give a sort of reboost to the Jacobite cause? Cumberland eventually crosses the border and moves up to Edinburgh, and then begins to move towards Stirling with the intention of moving into the Highlands and slowly squeezing the life out of what's left of the Jacobite cause. And as you can see from this map, we had to start piecing together all of the little fragments of evidence that started to creep in as to where the Jacobites had been sighted and where reliable reports were coming in. Most concerningly was that towards the end of January, Jacobite regiments were seen in full march around Glasgow. Now that the government team have worked this line of march out, I'm not giving any secrets away, filling in the gaps in the intelligence, because what's clearly happened is that as Cumberland has moved up on the east coast, heading towards Stirling, and as Argyll has sat anxiously in Perth, wondering whether to hold or to evacuate, the Jacobites have ignored both of them and have come up with their own plan. After passing through Stirling, they didn't move on Argyll. They didn't know his true strength, so they might have been tempted, had they had better intelligence or more cavalry to scout for them, they might have been tempted to go for Argyll, but instead they swept round into the Western Highlands. They were able there to link up with Tullibardine and his reinforcements, who had come down from Fort Augustus. And then, having joined up together, they held a council of war in Appin, linked with the French frigates, who by good fortune were in the area, able to resupply them, and then they decided to make a dash down Lomond side through Glasgow, and, can you believe it, they have decided to try and dodge past Cumberland once again, and with perhaps only around 2,000 men, make a dash into England. Now, what our government forces do not know is whether there are any other Jacobite forces other than these ones we've mentioned still in operation. Do they still have any forces in Scotland potentially able to threaten Argyll, or has everything the Jacobites have got been sent into the march to England? So now Cumberland is again turning his army around and moving back across the border. This time, though, he's on the east side and the Jacobites are on the west, the flip of what we had earlier in the campaign. Cumberland is moving down knowing that he has a powerful force himself, and also that the king down at London has a large force as well. The guards, the elite, both foot and horse, and those reinforcements that Cumberland perhaps presciently sent down earlier in the wake of Wetherby. Cumberland is also eagerly awaiting news as to whether the Hessians have in fact arrived in the south of England as directed. These have been much anticipated, coming over to replace the Dutch battalions that had to be transferred back to Europe earlier in the campaign. An influx of disciplined professional soldiers that could make a powerful difference in the south of England and alleviate concerns about the immediate security, at least, of London. So there's a strong force potentially in the south of England. Cumberland is coming down from the north too. Argyll has been released into the Highlands to squeeze out any remnants of Jacobitism up there, now that the Jacobite main army seems to have moved on. But there is one other important factor that has come into the discussions of British councils of war recently. Why have there been no confirmed sightings of Charles Edward Stuart since their reported conference of the chiefs in Appin? So as you can see, our campaign is in fact far from over. There is still lots happening and lots potentially to come. Is this the last desperate throw of the dice, or is it a brilliant strategic stroke from the Jacobites? Are they trying to end this quickly with a single motion, or are they trying to keep this war going long enough to persuade outside powers to intervene in their aid? Can they exploit the slower moving, more deliberate processes of the government responses, or will the weight of numbers simply reduce their options in the coming weeks to such an extent that their defeat becomes inevitable? I look forward to finding out with you over the coming weeks. I'll see you again.